My name is Helen Ward, and this part of my story begins on the day I finally came home for my last stretch of leave from the U.S. Army. I had been counting the days, imagining every detail of that moment over and over again during my deployment. For months, I thought about the warm scent of the pine trees around my neighborhood in Ridgeport, Colorado, and the quiet street where my small blue-painted house sat between two bigger homes. I bought that house myself, paying $140,000 that I collected through years of service, careful savings, overseas bonuses, and more sacrifice than most people ever see in one lifetime. That house was not just a building to me, it was a promise that one day I would build a peaceful life. It was stability in a world where everything else felt temporary and fragile. It was supposed to be a place where I could breathe without fear. As the military bus dropped me off near the main road, I walked the rest of the way to my house, dragging my heavy duffel bag behind me. The air felt sharp and cold, but I welcomed it. I loved Colorado winters, especially the way the mountains looked like tall giants covered in snow. Every step felt like a step toward a life I fought for, one that included my husband, Evan Doyle. I pictured him waiting for me at the door, smiling the way he used to when we first fell in love. I imagined him holding flowers, maybe a small bunch of lilies like he bought me on our first anniversary. I imagined him wrapping his arms around me and whispering that he missed me every single day. I even imagined he might say he was proud of me, even though he never said it out loud in the past few years. Still, I wanted to believe that time apart had changed something in him. When I reached the walkway, I could already feel something was off. The front door was slightly open, not enough to show anything inside, but enough to make me stop moving. Evan was careful about everything in the house. He never left doors open. Sometimes he even yelled at me for forgetting to lock it twice when I left for groceries. Seeing it like that made a strange feeling twist inside my chest. Not quite fear. Not yet. But something darker. A warning. I pushed the door open slowly, calling out his name in a soft voice, expecting him to jump out and surprise me. Evan? I'm home. My voice echoed through the living room, but the silence that followed felt uncomfortable. I stepped inside, and the warmth of the house hit me immediately. The heater was running, the lamps were on, and my favorite plaid blanket was thrown over the couch. Everything looked lived in. Used. Too used for someone who was supposed to be home alone. I dropped my bag near the doorway, the sound breaking the heavy quiet. That was when I heard it. A woman's laugh. Soft at first, then clearer. I froze. My heart started to beat faster, and my hands felt cold even though the room was warm. I knew that laugh didn't belong in my home. I knew immediately it wasn't mine, and it wasn't a TV. It was real. It was inside my bedroom. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that maybe Evan had friends over. Maybe a relative stopped by. Maybe anything. Anything but the truth that was already forming in my mind like a dark cloud. I walked through the hallway one slow step at a time, each one heavier than the last. The bedroom door was half open, and the laugh came again, mixed with a low voice that I knew too well. Evan's voice. He wasn't even trying to lower it. My breath felt stuck in my throat as I reached the door. I pushed it open, and the sight in front of me shattered something inside me that I thought could never break. There they were. Evan and a woman I had never seen before, tangled in my sheets on my bed, in the house that I paid for with every hour of my service. The woman, later I learned her name was Marcy Rivers, was lying against him, her hair spread across my pillow. She looked up first, her eyes widening in shock. She grabbed the blanket, pulling it to cover herself, but Evan didn't react the same way. His eyes opened, and instead of shame or guilt or even surprise, I saw something that I will never forget. A smirk. A slow, mocking smirk. He didn't jump or scramble for clothing. He didn't apologize or look afraid. He just laughed, a cold, unpleasant laugh that sounded like he had been waiting for me to walk in at that exact moment. Helen, he said casually, like he was greeting a neighbor. You're home early. Early. As if I had ruined his plans by coming home from the army too soon. As if I was the one interrupting him. I stared at him, trying to understand what kind of man could look at his wife, still in uniform, boots still dusty from the road, and laugh at her pain. Something inside me felt like it was cracking, not breaking exactly, but bending under the weight of betrayal. Marcy pulled away from him and scrambled to pick up her clothes from the floor. She wouldn't look at me, and I didn't care to look at her. This wasn't about her. This was about the man who promised to love me, the man who kissed me goodbye before every deployment, the man who told me he would take care of things at home while I served. And here he was in our bed with another woman laughing at me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands were shaking, but my mouth stayed shut. I felt anger rising through me, but it wasn't wild or uncontrolled. It was cold, sharp, focused. Years of military discipline held me still. Years of training taught me to breathe through moments of shock. And I did. I breathed. I stood there. And I let him finish laughing, because I knew the story was not ending here. When his smirk faded and he finally realized I wasn't crying or begging, he opened his mouth to speak again. But I didn't let him. I simply said, "Get out of my bed." And that was the beginning of everything that came next. When Evan finally stopped smirking at me, he swung his legs over the side of the bed with the same careless attitude he used when tossing a dirty shirt on the floor. He didn't bother covering himself, didn't show a single sign of shame or regret. He just sat there, looking at me with a lazy grin that made the anger in my chest grow like a slow, dangerous flame. Marcy had already grabbed her clothes and hurried toward the bathroom, her face red with embarrassment. She closed the door behind her, leaving just the two of us in the room that belonged to me more than it ever belonged to Evan. He leaned back on his hands and said, as if he had been waiting for the right moment to deliver the line, "This house is mine, Helen. Everything you own is mine. The agreement says so." For a second, the room seemed to tilt, and I felt like all the air had been sucked out. He said it so confidently, like he believed that piece of paper made him king of my life. He had always used that contract like a weapon during arguments, twisting words, raising his voice, claiming I didn't understand the legal world the way he did. But what he didn't know, what he never bothered to remember, was that the agreement wasn't what he thought it was. I stared at him, trying to decide whether he was stupid, arrogant, or just desperate to hurt me. Maybe it was all three. The memory of the contract flashed in my mind with every detail still clear, even though years had passed. I remembered the day we signed it, how young I was, how hopeful, how much I trusted him. I could still see us sitting in the small office of a lawyer I had met through one of my Army training programs. His name was Nathan Greer, a calm, steady man with gray hair and glasses that always slid down his nose. He had looked over the papers for us, making sure everything was legal, balanced, and fair. He told us we were smart for doing it, that planning for the future was better than ignoring it. What Evan didn't remember was that the agreement had 2 signatures and 2 sets of conditions. His favorite part, the one he used now, was the section that said all property bought after marriage would be considered joint. He clung to that like it was a lottery ticket. But the house in Ridgeport wasn't bought after marriage. I bought it before with my own savings and he moved in afterward. His name was only placed on the public paperwork because he insisted, claiming it would look better for family unity. At the time, I thought marriage meant trust. Now, standing in that ruined moment, I wished I had never let him sign anything. But none of that was the forgotten part. No, the part he forgot was the one he treated like a joke. The part that mattered now more than anything else. Years ago, when we were eating pizza in our tiny kitchen in July, long before all this, I told him about my fears. I told him that deployment changes people, that long distance breaks couples apart more often than anyone admits. I told him I didn't want to come home one day and find myself replaced. I said it quietly, almost laughing, because back then he made me feel safe enough to share my darkest thoughts. He laughed first, a real laugh back then, warm and not cruel. "Helen, I'd never cheat on you," he said. "If I ever did, you could break my legs for it." I remembered the exact moment he said it. I had paused with my bite of pizza halfway to my mouth. "Are you serious?" I asked. "As serious as a broken bone," he joked, holding up his slice like it was a toast. It stayed a silly line between us for weeks. We even mocked each other with it during dumb arguments. If you forget the laundry again, I'll break your legs, he'd joke. If you eat the last donut, I'll break yours, I'd reply. But one evening, when we were sitting with Nathan the lawyer, I brought it up again. It started as a joke, just a line to make Evan laugh. But Nathan didn't laugh. He adjusted his glasses and said, "If you want to include that clause, it has to be worded very clearly. It must show consent and understanding." Evan had signed the paper while still grinning.
"Put it in," he said.
She won't ever need it. It became official. A real clause. A legally binding line that said, if Evan Doyle ever cheated on Helen Ward, she had the right to break his legs. At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. I never planned to use it. I thought it would be nothing more than a story to tell friends one day, that funny thing we added to our marriage agreement. But the thing about life is that it doesn't care about what you think you will never do. It puts you in situations where your past choices suddenly matter more than anything. Standing in that bedroom, watching Evan's arrogant grin, I realized something deep and cold. He had forgotten. He truly believed he had the upper hand. He believed the agreement was his shield, not mine. He believed he could cheat on me, laugh in my face, and walk away with every piece of my life. He didn't remember the clause that would break his confidence and his legs. I breathed slowly, pushing back the rush of fury that threatened to burst through my chest. Evan mistook my silence for fear. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, smirk still ugly on his lips. "You should pack your things before I call a lawyer," he said. "I think it's best if you leave today."
Leave.
My house. My life. My future. I felt the anger settle into something even stronger than rage. Clarity. Calm. Razor-sharp clarity. "Evan," I said quietly, stepping deeper into the room. He raised an eyebrow, looking bored. "What?" I looked at him, really looked at him. A man who traded loyalty for cheap pleasure. A man who used my hard work to live comfortably while I served overseas. A man who thought he owned me. Then I said, "Do you remember the agreement?" His smirk faltered for the first time. "Yeah," he muttered. "So what? Do you remember all of it?" He frowned. The confusion in his eyes was the first honest emotion I'd seen from him that day. I didn't have to say anything else. I could see the memory clicking slowly in his mind, like gears grinding through rust. His eyes widened, not much, just enough for me to know he understood exactly what was coming. And in that moment, the power shifted. Not because of violence, not because of anger, but because he finally remembered the truth. The agreement didn't protect him.
It protected me.
And betrayal was lying right there in my bed. When the truth finally settled in the room, the air grew heavy in a way I had never felt before. Evan was still sitting on the edge of the bed, his expression flickering between confusion and fear as the memory of the agreement returned to him. For the first time since I walked through that door, he no longer looked confident. He no longer looked amused. He looked like a man who had pushed his luck too far. Marcy stayed in the bathroom, silent now, maybe listening, maybe trying to figure out how fast she could escape without meeting my eyes again. I didn't care what she did. She was nothing but a shadow in the corner of a moment that belonged entirely to Evan and me. I stepped closer, slow and calm, not rushing and not raising my voice. I didn't feel the wild anger people imagine in moments like this. Instead, I felt a kind of cold focus that I had only ever felt on missions overseas, in quiet moments before action. My training had taught me that losing control was the fastest way to lose yourself, and I refused to lose myself to Evan's betrayal. I stood there, steady and quiet, waiting for him to speak. He finally forced out a shaky laugh, but this time it sounded thin and fake. "Come on, Helen," he said. "You're not really thinking about that stupid clause. It was a joke. We were joking." "No," I said softly. "You were joking. I signed it because you promised me you would never cheat." He swallowed hard. "It doesn't matter. It's just a piece of paper." "No," I repeated. "It's a promise. And you broke it." In that moment he stood up, maybe thinking he could reach me, maybe thinking he could push past me, maybe thinking he could take control again. But when he moved toward me, something inside me snapped into perfect clarity. I didn't strike him out of wild rage. I didn't strike him as a wife scorned. I struck him as a soldier who had been handed the authority to act. My fist connected with his jaw, and the shock in his eyes was almost louder than his body hitting the floor. Years of training sharpened every muscle and every instinct. When I hit him again, he tried to crawl away, but I had already made my decision. This wasn't revenge born from chaos. This was the execution of a boundary he had agreed to. He had made me sign a contract for property. I had made him sign one for betrayal. Now both would be honored. He shouted at me to stop. He begged. He swore he loved me. He swore he never meant for it to happen. But none of his words mattered anymore. They were too late. They were empty. They came from a man who had mocked me in my own bed just minutes earlier. The room filled with the sound of his screams, and the woman in the bathroom finally burst out, clutching her clothes to her chest. She took one look at him, then at me, and ran down the hallway without saying a word. The front door slammed seconds later, leaving us alone. I didn't chase her. She was irrelevant. Evan was the one who made the promise. Evan was the one who broke it. When his legs finally gave beneath my blows, when he collapsed completely and lay on the floor sobbing, I paused. I stood over him, breathing hard but controlled. My hands shook slightly, but it wasn't from fear. It was from finality, the kind that comes when something deep inside you closes forever. I looked at him, really looked at him, lying there in my home in my life, and I knew the man I once loved had been gone long before this moment. Maybe he vanished the day he stopped calling during my deployments. Maybe he vanished the first time he raised his voice at me and called me cold for being tired after missions. Maybe he vanished the moment he decided another woman's arms were more comforting than mine. I stepped back and pulled out my phone. When I dialed the police, my voice was steady. I told them there had been an incident in my home. I told them my husband was injured. I didn't tell them more, because I didn't need to. The truth was written on paper, notarized years ago, sitting in a folder in my office drawer. By the time the officers arrived, the house felt eerily calm. Evan was still crying on the floor, clutching his legs.
His tears didn't move me.
His pain didn't shake me. His pleading didn't reach me. I was past all of that now. The officers stepped inside, and the moment their eyes met mine, I could see the mixture of confusion and professionalism. They were expecting a hysterical wife, maybe blood all over the walls, maybe a story of loss of control. Instead, they found me standing there, calm and steady, with a folder already open in my hand. "This is the marriage agreement," I said, handing it to the closest officer. He blinked, took it, and began reading. The other officer knelt beside Evan and asked him questions. Evan tried to shout that I attacked him, that I was dangerous, that he needed protection. But when the officer reached the specific clause, my clause, his eyebrows shot up so high I thought they might disappear into his hairline. "This is," he paused, cleared his throat, and read it again. Then he looked at me and said, "Well, ma'am, this is the strangest legal document I've seen in 30 years. "But it's legal," I replied simply. He nodded slowly. "It appears so." They took my full statement. I answered every question clearly. There was no hesitation in my voice, no trembling. I told them exactly what I walked in on, exactly what Evan said, exactly what I did, and exactly why the agreement existed. One of the officers even asked to take a picture of the document for their report, shaking his head the whole time, as if he had stepped into a world he didn't understand. When they finally loaded Evan onto a stretcher and carried him out to the ambulance, he looked back at me with a mixture of shame, shock, and something like realization. Maybe for the first time in years, he finally saw me, saw who I had become, saw what he had pushed me to, saw the strength he had always underestimated. I didn't follow the ambulance. I didn't cry. I didn't shout after him or apologize. I simply closed the door when the officers left and stood in the center of my living room. The house was quiet again. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something warm inside me. It was pride. Not pride in hurting him, but pride in standing up for myself after so long. Pride in honoring my own worth. Pride in refusing to be broken by a man who thought I was weak. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of cold water, and sat down at the table where we once laughed over pizza and silly promises. I rested my hands on the wood surface and breathed deeply, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket. For the first time since returning home, I felt like myself again. The weeks after the police took Evan away were strange in a quiet, heavy way. The house felt bigger, almost echoing every time I walked through it. I knew I couldn't stay there, not because I was afraid, but because every room held a memory I no longer wanted to carry. I packed my things slowly, giving myself time to think, to breathe, to understand who I was without him. I moved through Ridgeport like a ghost those first days, watching neighbors I had barely spoken to give me curious looks as I loaded boxes into my car. I didn't bother explaining anything. This part of my life was mine, and I no longer owed the world my pain. Once I left Colorado, I drove for days, stopping only when I needed to rest or when the road began to blur. I had no plan other than to put as much distance between myself and the house where everything broke. I didn't even know where I wanted to live. I only knew I needed a place where no one knew my name, where no one knew Evan Doyle, and where I could wake up without fear of his voice in my doorway. I ended up in Mapleview, Ohio, a small town with quiet streets lined with oak trees and old houses that seemed to lean kindly toward each other, as if offering support. The first week in Mapleview felt peaceful. I rented a small apartment near the edge of town with a large window that overlooked a wide field. Every morning, I watched the sunrise stretch across the grass, turning it golden. It felt like the world was reminding me that beginnings were still possible, even after endings that tore pieces of you away. I found a simple routine, running in the mornings, reading at the local cafe, going for long walks around Lake Kingswell. Some days, when the wind was soft and steady, I almost felt like the Helen I used to be before deployment, before betrayal, before anger taught me what cold strength felt like. But healing isn't a straight path. Some nights, I woke with images of Evan laughing in my face, that cruel smirk haunting me like a ghost. Other nights, I remembered the way he begged when his legs gave out. I didn't feel guilt for what I had done. My actions were justified, legal, and earned, but I did feel the weight of having been pushed to such a place. It reminded me that betrayal changes a person, reshapes them in ways that are sharp and hard to reverse. Months passed. The cold season came early that year, coating Mapleview in frost by late October. I kept to myself mostly, but I began to form small connections with people in town. A bookstore owner named Clara Hensley, a retired nurse named Margaret Doyle, no relation to Evan, thankfully, and a mechanic named Joseph Crane, who helped me fix my car after it struggled in the cold. These people didn't know my past, and that was what made them comforting. I wasn't a betrayed wife or a soldier with scars. I was just Helen, a quiet woman starting over. I thought Evan was gone forever from my life. I thought the chapter that held his name had closed completely. But one icy morning, long before the sun rose, I heard a soft knock at my door. At first, I ignored it, thinking maybe it was the wind or someone knocking on a neighbor's door. But the knock came again, this time followed by a voice I recognized instantly. Thin, strained, almost desperate. "Helen, please." My hands froze around the coffee mug I had just poured. For a moment, my breath felt trapped in my chest. I placed the mug down, walked to the door, and opened it. There he stood. Evan Doyle, once so arrogant, so full of false confidence, was now hunched over a pair of metal crutches. His hair was longer, unwashed, and his face had thinned so much he looked like a man who had lost a battle with himself. His clothes were wrinkled, old, and hanging loosely from his frame. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse from the cold, the wind pushing at him as if trying to sweep him away. "Helen," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, can we talk?" A part of me, the part that remembered the woman I used to be, felt a small tug of sympathy. But the rest of me, the stronger part, the part built from heartbreak and steel, remembered everything. His laughter, his betrayal, his cruelty, his attempt to take what I had earned, his disbelief when I stood up for myself. I remembered the moment he looked at me as if I were nothing. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady. He swallowed and seemed to shrink even more. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. Everything was a mistake.
Marcy left.
Everyone left. My family won't talk to me. I don't have anything left. I need you, Helen. I stared at him, letting his words fall to the cold air.
He needed me.
Not because he loved me. Not because he wanted to build a future. No, he needed me because he had nothing else. He wanted shelter. He wanted comfort. He wanted the person he once believed he could treat like property. You had your chance, I said quietly. You threw it away. I was stupid, he whispered. I was selfish. Please, just let me come in. Let me explain. I don't need an explanation, I said. I already lived it. His eyes filled with tears, real ones this time. I'm begging you. I shook my head slowly and stepped back, keeping the door between us like a boundary that should have existed years ago. No, Evan, I said firmly. You don't get to come back into my life. Not now, not ever. Go. He stared at me for several long seconds, hope dying slowly in his eyes. Then he lowered his head, turned around, and limped away down the snowy path. I watched him go until he disappeared behind the trees, swallowed by the winter morning. When I finally closed the door, a wave of relief washed over me so strong I had to lean against the wall. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't guilt. It was freedom, the kind I had never felt before. That week, I made a decision. I bought a small cottage near Lake Hazel for £40,000, a quiet place with stone walls, wide windows, and a view of the water that made every sunrise feel like a soft blessing. I spent my days writing my story, not for anyone else, but for myself. I walked the lakeside trails, made new friends, and discovered I liked being alone more than I ever imagined. For the first time in years, I wasn't living in someone else's shadow. I wasn't afraid of coming home. I wasn't rebuilding a life damaged by someone else's choices. I was simply Helen, and I was finally free.